Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Hope you're able to grab a cup of coffee or an iced tea. I'm Paul Spencer, and I have the honor of introducing the next panel. I'm an attorney with Disability Rights California in our voting rights practice group. I'm also a FOST advisory board member. So our second panel today is very timely because Governor Newsom recently announced that every California voter will receive a ballot in the mail for November. So this panel will discuss what we need to consider when expanding voting by mail in a state as diverse as California. So this panel is moderated by Kim Alexander, president and founder of the California Voter Foundation. The California Voter Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that advances the responsible use of technology in the democratic process and seeks to improve the voting process to better serve the needs and interests of voters. So thank you, Kim, for tackling this important topic today. And I will turn it over to you and let you introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Great. Welcome to the second panel. What do we consider when expanding voting by mail in a state as diverse as California? Please head on to the next slide. I'm going to just show you a couple quick slides. Here's me and California Voter Foundation logo. California Voter Foundation did a study in 2014 to look at the use of vote by mail in 3 counties, and that's up on our website. I invite you to come look at it. Go on to the next slide, please. I'm happy to say that a lot of the things that we suggested in that study have been implemented, but we have a persistent problem in California with vote by mail ballot rejection. On average, about 1.7% of ballots cast as vote by mail ballots in the state get rejected. And this is primarily due, as was said earlier, to late arrival or problems with voter signatures. Next slide. So we are currently conducting a study with the California Civic Engagement Project examining mail ballot rejection in Sacramento, Santa Clara, and San Mateo counties. And this study is being funded through grants from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and the County of Sacramento. If you could advance the next slide. And just to mention, we will have some findings coming out about that soon, and Mindy Romero on this panel will be sharing a couple of preliminary findings. We do hope to expand the study to look at more counties, more elections, and even possibly more states. For the March primary, California Voter Foundation developed some social media graphics to help more voters successfully cast vote by mail ballots. And I want to invite voter outreach groups to use these graphics, customize them if you like. I'm just going to throw them up on the screen here real quick. If you go to the next slide. This is one that we made. What do you do with that ballot you get in the mail? Fill it in, sign the envelope, and get it in on time. Next slide shows who to contact if you have voting questions. And the next slide shows, reminds voters that you can check your voting status online, your registration status, your ballot status. These are great tools. So I think, as James Schwab mentioned, it would be great for all of us to encourage voters to utilize these tools for November. Next slide. So we have 3 wonderful people to hear from on this panel. I'm going to just give you a quick introduction about each of them. First of all, we have Courtney Bailey Canelos. She is the Registrar of Voters for Sacramento County. She has 15 years experience in voter registration and elections. She was a key figure in the transition from polling places to vote centers for the county's implementation of the Voters' Choice Act in 2018. And she chairs Sacramento County's Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee and is a member of the State Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee. Our second panelist, actually he'll be our third panelist, is James Woodson. He's the Senior Policy Manager for California Calls, where he manages the organization's work around the 2020 census, redistricting, and the Voters' Choice Act. He is a member of the Secretary of State's VCA Task Force, as well as the Voters' Choice Los Angeles Steering Committee, and he is also on the leadership team of the Black Census and Redistricting Hub. And our third panelist is Mindy Romero. She is the founder and director of the California Civic Engagement Project at the University of Southern California's Saul Price School of Public Policy in Sacramento. She is a political sociologist with a PhD in sociology from UC Davis. Her research focuses on political behavior and race/ethnicity and seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and the US. So we'll turn it over to Mindy and her slides. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Thanks.
I have a lot of data to present to you, and I'm going to be going through it pretty quickly. Know that just about everything that I'm showing you is currently available up on our website. So most of it is research that we've done over the last number of years, published in a variety of different research briefs. And then as Kim already mentioned, at the end of my slides, or near the end of my slides, I'm going to present briefly some new research from the study that we're doing together with the CCP and the CBF around ballot rejections. So next slide, please. Just jumping in. Just making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of just the current status of vote by mail in California and kind of the trend over time. Next slide. This is data just directly from the Secretary of State's office. Simple slide just showing how we have increased in the proportion of our ballots that have been vote by mail over the last decade and a half. So looking at the general election in 2004, 32% of all ballots cast in that election were vote by mail ballots. And of course, not all of those go through the mail. A good chunk of those in any given election get dropped off. To the most recent primary in March, where we saw 72%, and that was the largest proportion that we've seen thus far in our state, 72% of all ballots were vote by mail ballots, whether mailed or dropped off. Next slide, please. And we shall see what November brings us, especially given the governor's order establishing that everybody will be mailed, every registered voter will be mailed a vote by mail ballot. Now, in addition to our increase that we've seen in the use around vote by mail and the proportional use around vote by mail, we know that there are still significant disparities by race, ethnicity, age, and a number of other statuses when it comes to actually using vote by mail. So just showing you some recent research, the most recent general election 2016, that number was 58% member for everyone. We have it again on this chart in front of us. But for Latinos in that election, 47% of their ballots were vote by mail ballots. So not 58, but 47%. For Asian Americans, 66% of their ballots cast were vote by mail ballots. And we don't, for this study, we don't unfortunately have data for African Americans or whites, but just to show for Latinos and Asian Americans, very different there in terms of the proportion of their ballots that are vote by mail. Next slide, looking at age, just really quickly, just slide simply shows the different kind of established age groups in California and their use around vote by mail. So ranging from 53%, again in the 2016 general election, 53% of all 18 to 24-year-old ballots cast, age 18 to 24, to 71% of those ballots cast by folks that are 65 plus. Next slide. Okay, so why do California voters choose vote by mail instead of voting in person? So our research center has done a lot of work trying to understand voting behavior and a lot of research around this choice. And I'm really careful to underscore here, the word choose is not always a choice, right? There are significant reasons why, and I'll talk about this in a moment, why voters do use in-person voting options or use the mail, whether they drop it off or actually put it through the mail ballots. And for some folks, these amount to real constraints. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding that choose sometimes is not always such a simple equation. Next slide. So this research, as I said, I'm going to go through a number of research studies. This research is from a representative statewide survey we did a couple election cycles ago. And we found that typically VBM, vote by mail voters, why do they use vote by mail? 72% of them said it was more convenient than going to a neighborhood polling place on election day, and they could pick multiple reasons why they choose vote by mail. 67% preferred to fill out their ballots in a place where they could look things up on the internet. 60% didn't want to wait in line at their neighborhood polling place, and about half preferred to fill out their ballots where they could discuss it with family and friends. Next slide. There we go. For polling place voters, overwhelmingly, why they choose to, choose in some form to use an in-person experience, 97% said it was because that polling place was convenient for them to get to. So it was in their neighborhood, it was their children's school, it was close by in some way. It felt like it was the logical thing for them to do, right, being convenient. 90% going to the polling place on election day was an important part of their voting experience, how they defined the voting experience, and 64% wanted to get the sticker, the vote by mail, the high voter sticker. Next slide, please. Some group differences. So I'm going to switch over to the same study. It was a multi-method study, but moving away from the representative statewide survey, we also did focus groups with historically underrepresented groups in our state. So now I'm going to talk about that research, those findings from the focus groups. So for folks that were typically vote by mail voters, Latino vote by mail voters noted that work hours can sometimes make it inconvenient to go to the polls, so that's why they use VBM. They also talked about a preference of being able to consult with family when making their voting decisions, so around the kitchen table, so to speak. For those that chose polls, our focus group voters that were Latino said, or at least generally Latinos were more likely than members of other groups to cite the social aspect of voting as a reason for voting in person. And the young voters really talked about wanting that first-time voter experience to be in person. Next slide, please. So we also did focus groups with voters with disabilities, and we heard, as Fred's already talked about a moment ago, Fred Neeson, if you were on the earlier panel, a strong desire to be seen representing the disability community and a highly value the right to cast a private ballot at a polling place. So we heard that quite strongly in our focus groups. And that's putting aside the comments that we also heard around the frustration around being able to get to an accessible voting machine, whether there was one, whether it was working, whether it was available to them. We also heard, and I want to make sure that I note this, desires, and this is more broadly from folks, a desire around language assistance, folks that needing language assistance, wanting to make sure that wanting to go to the polls because they could get that assistance there. And also heard a lot about just needing assistance with their vote by mail ballot. Either they didn't get it, there was an issue with it, they damaged it in some way, needed it replaced. Questions around the vote by mail process, leading those voters to go to in-person location. And I think maybe one or two of our panelists might be talking about that a little bit later, so I'll move on from there. Next slide, please. And then we also conducted focus groups with African American voters, and we actually released a brief on this, a research brief, which is on our website if you want to learn more. But again, just giving highlights here today. The most commonly shared reasons for voting in person from African American voters that we talked to was a lack of confidence and trust that their vote would be counted if their ballot were to be sent through the mail, a desire to be seen representing the African American community when voting, following a family or community tradition of voting in person, a strong desire to enjoy the social aspects of voting, and also wanting to represent, especially for kids, and being seen wearing that vote by mail sticker. Next slide. We also heard about trust. Trust was a big part of our research, came up in the focus groups, and then now I'm going to switch over back to our representative statewide survey that I mentioned to you a little while ago. We heard so much about trust in the focus groups, we made sure to include that in our representative statewide survey. And specifically of those voters that didn't send a vote by mail ballot through the mail. So either they were a vote by mail ballot voter, but they dropped it off, or they were typically a voting in person voter. Those respondents, 27% of them said they didn't trust the USPS to get their ballots delivered safely on time, so they weren't using the mail for voting, or in time to be counted. But there were differences by race ethnicity quite significantly. So 29% of Latinos said they didn't trust the USPS, 32% African Americans, and 47% of Asian Americans didn't trust the USPS to get their ballot in on time. Age also a difference, 36% of young voters age 18 to 29, and 29% of older voters 65 plus. And I see Gail's giving me the time here, and I just wanna give a brief reminder. I think I was given a couple extra minutes for my slides, so hopefully she's calculating that in there too. Next slide, please. And this chart here, the slide is just visualizing everything that I just said. So we're going to make these, all of these PowerPoints, of course, available, and I'll let you look at the details on that later. Next slide, please. Rejection rates in California. So vote by mail use has increased quite significantly, but of course, vote by mail ballots have to be verified. They have to get there on time, even with our new law postmark plus 3 days, but they have to also be signature verified. Next slide, please. So from our research at the California Civic Engagement Project, we know that, well, first off, just simply rejection rates have fluctuated. So the rejection rate is simply the share of vote by mail ballots that are cast in any given election. What percent of those VBM ballots didn't get counted? They were rejected. Next slide, please. So this chart just visualizes what was on the slide previously, that the rejection rate in California has fluctuated. In the 2018 general election, it was 1%. We don't yet know what it was for, or at least I don't have the knowledge of what it was for the primary yet. So 1% of our vote by mail ballots rejected in November 2018. That equated to 85% 85,000 ballots that were rejected. Next slide, please. This slide is just simply, this chart is visualizing what I just said. You can see the 85,000 in November 2018 was actually more than what we saw in the November 2016 election. And as, of course, we increase in the proportion of ballots that are vote by mail and the overall number of vote by mail ballots, even if we kept the rejection rate the same and low and steady over time, it still is a proportion of a larger pie, right? And so that's something to consider. Next slide, please. And we've done a lot of research at the CCP also to identify, and this is again in different sets of research products, that there are rejection rates, as a state as a whole vary very significantly by subgroup. So the 1% in 2018 varies by race, ethnicity, age, military status, language preference, again, what's in the voter file, right, as what people want for their, or at least identified in the file as their language preference around their materials. Voting method, whether they drop it off, whether they mail it. Nativity, geography differs significantly by county. And you can look all of that up for some additional information if you're interested. The top 3 rejection rates are always late, signature doesn't match, and no signature, but this does significantly vary by county and by subgroup within county. Next slide, please. And I just am getting a text from somebody. Yes, the slides again will be available, I think, through the Future of California elections. So now I'm going to talk just really quickly about that new study that we're conducting in partnership with CVF, California Voter Foundation. These are preliminary findings. We haven't yet released the research. And this is focused on 3 counties, as Kim said, Santa Clara, Sacramento, and San Mateo. Next slide, please. There. Their rejection rate, specifically again for the November 2018 general election, state as a whole was 1%. Sacramento was 8% of VBM ballots rejected. Sorry, 0.8. Sorry, Courtney. Santa Clara was 0.7. San Mateo, 1%. Next slide. And I just want to emphasize, just for time, I'm just going to show age. But those age 18 to 24 young voters are overrepresented. So as an example of what I said earlier about groups having different types of rejection rates, well, it means that they can be over or underrepresented amongst vote by mail, amongst those that are rejected, those ballots that are rejected. So here in Sacramento, young voters were 20% of rejected ballots in the November 2018 general election, but they were only 6.7% of VBM voters overall. In Santa Clara, 25% of all ballots rejected, but 7% of VBM ballots overall. San Mateo, 21% versus 6%. Next slide, please. Almost done. These 2 charts just visualize what I just said. You can see on the far left, 18 to 24, this is their percent of rejected ballots in these counties. Next slide. And the bar chart simply goes way down, right, because they're a much smaller percentage of the vote by mail population in each of these counties. Next slide, please. So lastly here, the other thing that we want to note that specifically in Sacramento County, in the last 3 elections, most ballots rejected were due to lateness in recent elections. Due to lateness in those last 3 elections. They're postmarked after Election Day, could not have been accepted even with a longer grace period for arrival. That's something to note. A significant percentage of ballots are not postmarked or have an unreadable postmark. And what that all means is that increasing awareness about USPS pickup practices and dating one's signature on the ballot envelope could help reduce ballot rejection due to those late postmarks and missing or unreadable postmarks. Last slide, in conclusion, we'll see, we expect that our vote by mail use rate in California will likely be higher in the primary, given everything we've been talking about. We'll see what that is. But to keep in mind that there are historic patterns of disparate vote by mail use, right, across race, ethnicity, and all the other groups that I mentioned. Important reasons why people choose to vote in person that can be real barriers to voting and transitioning to the mail. Greater numbers of rejected ballots in 2020. And disparities again in those vote by mail rejection rates. And just a quick note, very soon in our May 21st presentation, that event, if you've heard about it, that we're putting on for LA County with of course the Future of California Elections and the LA County Elections Office, we're going to also be presenting briefly some new research around how voters are thinking about voting in November. And next slide, I'm done. Sorry for going over there a little bit. And we can skip Q&A if you want to move on to the next panelist.
So we're just going to kind of go over a bit of the logistics today for Sacramento County and what we've seen with switching to all vote by mail. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is a chart that shows the vote by mail trends in Sacramento County over time. You can see how it really changed. So we started in November 2000, and then around November 2008, we were really seeing a split between voting in person and voting by mail. And then we saw an increase through 2014, 2016. And then, of course, when we moved to the Voters' Choice Act in 2018, we saw that big jump. You can also see by this chart that for general elections, we always see a slightly larger number of people choosing to vote in person. So that's something we definitely have to take into consideration as we make plans for November. Next slide, please. This chart kind of just gives an overview of how people actually return their vote by mail ballot. So for March, we had a significant number use the drop box. We had a significant number drop off their ballots at a vote center, but the most common method was still by mail. But if you consider the drop box and the vote center numbers together, they actually surpassed those that chose to return their ballot by mail. This election in March, we did see a 6% increase of people returning their ballot by mail. We're not sure if it's because we had prepaid postage, since we didn't have that in 2018. We also included an I voted sticker in the vote by mail packet this time, because we do have stickers at all of our drop boxes and vote centers. And not sure, just with the current situation with COVID-19, if that prompted more people to return their ballot by mail. So there's a few reasons why we might have seen an increase of returning their ballot by mail versus what we saw in 2018. Next slide. Just to give a little overview of what is done to validate and confirm vote by mail ballots. Since there are a lot of questions regarding security of vote by mail, it's important to understand the basics of the process and know there are different elements to ensure that the processing and the counting of the vote by mail is secure. So in Sacramento County, we do use a mail sorter, which takes a picture of the return envelope in order to do the signature comparisons. We can then use that sorter to sort down for precinct level or by district, by ballot type. Counties do it differently. We kind of do a hybrid where we sort down by precinct level through election day, and then we do a mixed batch after election day. That helps us in order to see if there might be any recounts or close contests we might have to look at further. After that portion, then we go through the signature verification, where we compare from the voter's registration form and any supporting documentation from forms that maybe we've sent the voter over the years. We can also look back at previous registration forms in order to help us make a good comparison as far as if that is the voter and maybe their signature has declined, or as we know, those DMV signatures are not always the easiest to verify the eligibility of the vote by mail envelope. But again, we look at all records possible to count that ballot. If it is challenged, we have a supervisor review the physical ballot to look for any other markings on the envelope, and then we will initiate that voter contact that was discussed earlier. We then move into the extraction of all the good ballots, which I'll talk about more in a moment, and then we'll process the ballots. So any ballots that are damaged or torn, we remake them so we can scan them, and we have quality control teams that go over that process, and that process is observable by the public. We also go over to determine any sort of voter intent issues. So even if maybe they didn't bubble it in all the way or they crossed something out, we can make those determinations and make sure that we count the ballot the way the voter wanted. And then we move into tabulation and releasing of the results. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So things that we take into consideration with the vote by mail. The first one is community input. And I think it's really important to address what your community says on why maybe they're not comfortable voting by mail, especially as we work out voting options through this pandemic. what does your community say about why they're not comfortable voting by mail? And I know Mindy and her team have a lot of great research done on that. And it's important to hear what those comments are so that your messaging can be built around that. Whether or not it's the process, and also making sure that you're opening your office to any sort of observations. I know observations are going to be a little bit more challenging this election, and I saw Neil in Orange County set up, which looked great. Monterey County actually has the coolest setup with glass walls, but that is something you're going to have to keep in mind, whether you do live video streaming. How are you going to open up your process to ensure that when you go through your ballots, people are confident they're being counted? The next item is privacy. One of the big concerns we had when we moved to vote by mail was people were afraid that we were looking at their return signed envelope and how they voted. So we started doing some outreach and media on our extraction machine, and our extracting actually demonstrates that the information is covered up and it goes so fast that we really don't have time to go through and compare and see how people voted. Once we showed the video of using the extraction machines, it seemed to quell some of those concerns about the privacy of the vote by mail process. We do take steps to make sure that everyone's ballot does remain private through this process. We also have the accessibility concerns that Fred touched on and a few others touched on, and we have the accessible vote by mail. The first time we used it, we only had 4 people use the accessible vote by mail. This last March election, we had 52, so we have seen an increase. But again, the messaging and the outreach around that system does need to be improved, especially in the upcoming November election. We have made our a demonstration site go live so that people in our community can start testing it and getting familiar with it now, and we're encouraging sharing those links and kind of the fake credentials we have in order to get used to the system. So we're trying to get the word out on usage and that as a viable option. And then one thing we learned too by working with our community is that we realized for voters who are blind or have low vision, you know, they don't even know what's on the envelope. There are things required by code that tells us that we have to put on the envelope, whether it's the address or a witness or someone authorized to drop off a ballot. But the voters, some of them don't have any idea on what's required in order for a ballot to count. So we're going to try to do more outreach and information, especially on the accessible vote by mail side, to describe what is on the ballot, where the voter should sign. We have 2 hole punched in order to kind of indicate where a voter should sign, and just more information on what that envelope actually looks like. The tracking, we used Ballot Track, so that was very helpful for voters to get the information on if their ballot counted, and they got that immediately. It kind of took us back a little bit, but it also realized where we might need more staff training, and it was great to see such a great turnout. I think it was over 80% of the voters who used Ballot Tracks actually had a returned valid ballot, so it's great to see that usage. And then it's important on the security to know there are multiple steps that we do to ensure that vote by mail ballots are processed securely and accurately. We have the signature verification. We have chain of custody, that's teams and quality control teams of people with the ballots at all times. We have voter contact, reaching out to those voters if something is wrong or if we have any questions. We also have that manual tally or risk limiting audit procedure to show that those ballots are being counted based on voters' intent. Opening the office to observation is a huge part. And then the last item is the one that's, I know a lot of concerns is about ballot harvesting. And that's something that we want to encourage. As we know, there are the code itself states that it allows for people to be able to pick up and return ballots for others. And so we want to outreach to voters to make sure that they are comfortable with who they're giving their ballot to. They understand they have a choice, and if they're not comfortable, don't do it. And so there's a lot of outreach and education on that. And I know Riverside County put out, I think it was in a response to a PRA, but they put out some great code citations and how they follow that. So, so definitely been learning from other counties on how to process that. But we want to encourage voters that keeping their ballot in their hands is the safest option, or give it to someone you trust. And of course, if anyone wants code changes, you're welcome to have at it. All right, so I think that does it for me. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Woodson. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at California Calls. I think my slides will pop up in a second, but while they do, I want to just kind of highlight, and we can actually just go straight to the second slide, please. And apologies, I think the slides are animated, so you may have to click a couple of times. So, you know, in terms of our focus, I'm really on this call representing a few different bodies. So first is California Calls, which is an alliance of 31 organizations across the state, all community-based organizations. We're part of a larger coalition called the Million Voters Project, which is also a group of statewide networks of community-based organizations. But then there's also the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub, which is 35 Black-led and Black-serving organizations that came together to maximize participation in the census and redistricting processes. If you keep clicking through on the left, on the right-hand side, you'll see really what our focuses are on. We do integrated voter engagement to these groups. So urban, rural, and suburban counties across the state. We do voter outreach to new and infrequent voters, young people, communities of color, poor and working class neighborhoods. And a lot of the focus of this talk today for me is gonna be really kind of taking folks into the world of these folks and the challenges that they might face in using vote by mail. Next slide, please. You know, the first point that we wanted to kind of make is the vote by mail is certainly not a silver bullet. You know, there certainly is a thing around safety with the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of health, but there's also a piece around safety around your ballot, right? And whether you will feel comfortable that your ballot, once it's cast either by mail or in person, is actually counted the way that you want it to be. And so while the state is certainly moving to vote by mail, not everybody is there and not everybody is able to use vote by mail. So I wanna just talk about a little bit about the reasons why. And again, if you keep scrolling through, you'll see some of the reasons why folks may not be able to use vote by mail and why it's so important. I know that other folks have lifted this up, to have safe, accessible, in-person voting locations. You know, we know based on Mindy's research that some folks don't trust the mail. Some folks actually might need a replacement ballot if they lose it or if they just don't get it in the mail. Folks will need in-person language and physical assistance. There are folks that don't have an address at all, and specifically kind of referring to homeless folks, and how would they use vote by mail, right? There's folks that, you know, never will hear about the shifts or the changes. You know, we'll talk a little bit about in a second why folks may not trust sort of government sources of information. And so folks may not actually even hear about the changes and may just get a vote by mail ballot in the mail and not know what to do with it or why they're receiving it. You'll have folks that are new to voting, and need in-person assistance, and then folks that aren't registered to vote but want to vote on the same day. And so, again, important to have those kind of in-person locations to allow for that. Next slide, please. One of the things that we wanted to highlight here is that really there's a convergence of factors for the November election. So again, if you keep clicking through, you know, we know that the presidential election is coming and that there's typically higher voter turnout, especially of the communities that I mentioned before. And so we'll know that there'll be more folks that want to vote. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been having a disproportionate impact on a lot of those communities that I lifted up, and we'll talk about that in a second a little bit more. There's government distrust that's at an all-time high. We'll also talk about that a little bit more. And then we know that there's also historic disenfranchisement. And so really these last three factors are the things that I want to focus on in my time that remains. Next slide, please. So again, while we know that the presidential elections tend to bring out more, more voter turnout, we also know that folks of color are being, again, disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which means there's more unemployment in those communities, there's more displacement, there's more things that folks are having to deal with. And so it's more likely that, again, either folks just don't hear about it because they're either a caretaker or having to work or just having to deal with the illness, or they're less likely to actually receive a ballot because they're living with somebody else, or just not at their address, right? So again, just highlighting the impact on communities of color and the burden that they're facing right now. Next slide, please. The other point here is that we just have to remember the kind of disproportionate impact historically that communities of color have faced, right? We have, folks that really look at, people in power in a certain way, right? Liberty, freedom, and look at America in that way. But you also have folks that have a very different historical perspective, and so are going to be a little bit more hesitant to use vote by mail. Next slide, please. We also know, again, that there's been historic efforts to really disenfranchise folks, across our country. On the left-hand side, you see some of those historic pieces, but on the right-hand side, we know, again, nationally, and not necessarily here in California, but nationally, we have a whole lot of different efforts to really disenfranchise folks, right? And so for communities of color, they're seeing that on TV. Their families are experiencing it. For some folks like me, you've lived in other states and are coming to California with that kind of history from other states. So just remembering that folks have had to deal with a lot of, intentional efforts to disenfranchise folks that are gonna, shift their view of how they look at casting a ballot and vote by mail. Next slide, please. The other point here is that we also have other kind of societal dynamics that are happening that are fueling the government distrust. So you have political, racial, social, economic divisions in our country right now. You have increasing white supremacy. The photo on the right was actually taken from California, right? So we know that there's a rise in white supremacy. We have policies that are targeting specific communities. We also have gerrymandering that is happening, and we know that a lot of the citizenship question debate was really centered around disenfranchising and diminishing the political power of communities of color, which are all seeding, again, this government distrust that we see. And the next slide, please, and I'll wrap up here. So implications for our work in particular, again, in our efforts to do voter engagement. One is that we know that we're going to have to do early education and conversion on vote by mail, particularly for folks that are most at risk. We need to teach them how to fill out a vote by mail ballot. We need to teach them that to expect one in the mail and how to return it. So we know that there needs to be a lot of early education on that. We also know, to make people feel comfortable to vote at an in-person voting location, that we'll have to do education on the health and safety protocols that are in place. Because what we don't want is for folks to feel unsafe and so then just stay home and not cast a ballot at all. So we want them to feel safe that if in-person is the method that they need to use, that they feel safe to use it. Obviously we know that there has to be continued partnerships between election officials and community-based organizations on placements of voting location, on the public education pieces. And again, kind of highlighting this last bullet point, we need a trusted messenger strategy, because again, all of the factors that we pointed out around distrust of government, we really need folks from the community that are lifting up the importance of voting, but also how folks can cast a ballot, as we're expanding to vote by mail, but continuing to maintain these in-person locations. And I will hand it back to Kim to take us into Q&A.
Thank you, everyone. That was really a fantastic panel. We had a couple questions that came through the Q&A, and we've been trying to answer them in the Q&A. One that I was attempting to answer is about the graphics that I showed at the beginning from California Voter Foundation. Please contact me at kimalex@calvoter.org. I'm happy to help you customize those graphics for other states. And then there was a question about how do we know the ethnicity of the voters whose ballots are rejected? I wondered, Mindy, if maybe you wanted to hop on and try to answer that question live.
Sure. I actually did answer it in the Q&A. So for time,
Okay.
yeah, I would just refer people there.
Okay, great. And then there was another question about rejected ballots. Just to clarify, there is a new law that does require all voters who have signature issues, whether missing or mismatched signature issues, to be contacted by their county registrar of voters and given a chance to supply a valid signature. So we are making some progress on signature rejection, but we still have some of these persistent problems. Hopefully our new study that's underway will help provide some clues about what else we can be doing to minimize this problem and make vote by mail more successful for all Californians. And with that, I think, unless anyone has any last minute comments or answers to any of the questions that you saw, Mindy or Courtney or James, I think we can turn it back over to Katie.